Hello, my name is Dave Jennings, and we're continuing in our classes on looking at Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. In this session, we're going to be looking at Jesus Christ in the Psalms. Now, Jesus is talked about a number of times in the Psalms. They were actually the Psalms written by a number of authors. Most are associated with King David, but many others besides King David contributed. King David himself lived about 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. And of all the books of the Bible, it seems the Psalms are the most focused on the coming Messiah. Some of the Psalms have rightly been called messianic because they speak of the coming Messiah, an obvious prophecy about the future work of Jesus. We're just going to look at two of these Psalms. Psalm 22 is what we're going to start with. We look at Psalm 22, and we look for clues about how we can see Jesus in the Old Testament as we begin looking for statements that are made in this psalm, but also by Jesus. So we start off in Psalm 22 and verse 1, and it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning?" Now those words, for those who have been reading in the New Testament, sound very familiar. The psalm is describing a terrible ordeal that is experienced by the one who says these words. And we're going to come back and look at those in a few moments. But where in the Bible do we see these same words being used? This is looking for an echo, something that we have heard before. And of course, we know that this is when Jesus was on the cross in the last part of his life. Whenever he says in Matthew chapter 27, it's recorded for us at verse 45, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay, now we're closing in on how to see Jesus in the Old Testament. One way is when we see Jesus himself quoting from a psalm. That directs the Bible student to go back to Psalm 22 and to learn more about this dreadful experience on the cross. So let's go back 1,000 years and look at the psalm and see what it has to say about the crucifixion of Jesus. Now we want to see in Psalm 22 the precise details that are given that describe the crucifixion of Jesus. Psalm 22 verse 7, all who seek me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Or in Mark's account, we read, and those that passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. And also the chief priests and with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may say and believe him. Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. So we go back to Psalm 22, and we read these words. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It's melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death, for dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, friends, even with a basic knowledge of the crucifixion, we can readily see how this was prophetic in great detail of the crucifixion experience for Jesus. Let's look at a few of these details. In Psalm 22, it says, my tongue sticks to my jaws. In John 19, we read, after this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put it on a sponge. They put a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. Or how about this one? In Psalm 22, it says, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. In Matthew 27:35, using the King James here, we read, and they crucified him and parted his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture did they cast lots. So we're only briefly looking at this messianic psalm, just a few of the details, but we can clearly see how Psalm 22 spoke about the crucifixion of Jesus 1,000 years before it happened. Jesus himself, during the 33 years of life that he had on the earth, would have read this passage and known quite well about the suffering that he would endure. Yet because of his obedience to God and love for us, he endured the shame and the pain of the cross. Our second psalm is found in Psalm 16, written by David. And this is what it reads. Psalm 16 and verse 8, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. That word Sheol is really the word that we would understand for the word grave or pit. So you will not abandon my soul to the grave, or let your Holy One see corruption. Now this is written by David 1,000 years before Christ. So again, what we're doing is looking for places in the New Testament that might alert us to this being a psalm that speaks of speaks of Jesus. So where do we find these words quoted in the New Testament? Acts chapter 2. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. For David says concerning him, I saw the Lord always before me. Here's our Psalm 16 quote. I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue rejoiced. My flesh also will dwell in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, that's the Greek form of the word for grave, or let your Holy One see corruption. So here we have Peter in the New Testament talking about the words from Psalm 16. And what he's doing is he's describing this as the hope of David, that the Holy One of God would not remain in the grave and see decay and corruption. And he goes on in that same chapter in Acts 2, and he says, brothers, I say to you with confidence about the patriarch David, that he is both dead, that he has died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. You see, in our review of Psalm 22, we saw how Jesus would have been able to read about his crucifixion details long before they actually occurred. And while this would have been difficult, it allowed him to prepare for what was surely coming. But in this case, reading Psalm 16, Jesus could read this and know that he wasn't going to be left in the grave. He would not see corruption. And he knew, just as certain as the details of the crucifixion, that he would be resurrected by his Father. There are so many other Psalms that we could speak about that talk about the life and the work of Jesus. We read of his miracles. We can read about his relationship with his family, his betrayer, and those who are close in his relationship with him and his Father. The Psalms are evidence of the validity and the veracity of Scripture. Jesus loved the Psalms and he taught from them. And it's important that when we read the Psalms, that we look for Jesus Christ. In our last class, we will look at the words of the prophets who spoke wonderfully about Jesus, about his life, his death and resurrection, and in great detail about the role he will yet fulfill when he returns to the earth to be king forever.